Ladies and gentlemen, today I want to tell you how Lord Grey, yes, the one after whom the tea variety is named, taught his wife, his young wife, about a happy family life. Lord Grey got married, and the morning after the wedding, they went horseback riding to tour his estate. Lord Grey's horse stumbled, and he said, "One." Another 10 minutes passed, and it stumbled again. "Two," said Lord Grey. The third time, Lord Grey got off the horse, took out a small pistol, put it to her ear, and shot her. "Lord," cried Lady Grey, "are you out of your mind?" "Once," said Lord Grey. The couple lived together until old age without ever having a quarrel. I remember this childhood story when Trump announced that Iran had 40 days. Do you remember what happened on the 41st day? Now Trump has given Russia 50 days. Well, after all, the country is a bit bigger than Iran, right? And there are idiots who are already asking what will happen on the 51st day. Everyone who cares about the events in Ukraine was waiting for Trump to announce punishment for Putin for his lies and delays. Some are satisfied, some say it's too little and too late, and some just hate for no reason. Well, one hates Ukraine, another hates Putin, and a third hates Trump. So it doesn't matter who hates whom, but someone hates someone. They all shout that, except for shooting the one they hate. Nothing else can be done at all. Well, the world is practically ready for World War III. In reality, China has economic problems, and on top of that, the power of its general secretary is shaky. Iran is on the verge, I would say, of civil unrest. If not outright wars, then internal coups, upheavals, conspiracies. And Russia is having the ground pulled out from under its feet. It could flare up just like it did with the First and Second World Wars, because if you look into it, those wars also flared up for a reason. The only thing holding it back today is the power of the United States of America and the understanding that Trump and his team have enough resolve. At the end of this video, by the way, we'll talk about the chances of war and the chances of victory, of reason. It's never 100%, it's never zero either. In general, it's usually closer to 0 than to 100. And I'll try to explain to you convincingly enough, if not mathematically, then at least why from 30%, the victory of reason. Our chances have increased to 51%, which is almost unbelievable. Again and again, President Trump tries to end wars without using force, but by threatening economic and military sanctions. This is not war, this is the threat of war, which, as they say in Odessa, are two very different things.
Today we made a deal where we will send them weapons and they will pay for them. We, the United States, will not receive any payments. We are not buying this, but we will produce it and they will pay for it. Our last meeting a month ago was very successful because they agreed to what amounts to more than $1 trillion a year. They are affluent nations with substantial wealth.
During the NATO countries meeting, Trump achieved an unprecedented success. An unprecedented, unexpected, unprecedented success. Everyone except for one country agreed to purchase weapons and spend 5% of their budget on defense. That has never happened before. That has never happened before. That puts $1 trillion into NATO's pocket for the next, I think, 10 years, if I'm not mistaken.
They have a lot of money and they want to do it. They really want it and we really want it too.
Let's discuss this with the reporter. Olivia Rinaldi, she's live now at the White House. How confident is the White House at this point that sending missiles to NATO for possible use by Russia and Ukraine will lead to the end of the war?
Rit, that's a really good question because it shows that at least the White House is saying the following. First of all, they need something that will force Russia to come to the negotiating table. And this is expressed in the form of those very tariffs that we'll talk about a little later. But also, this new package of weapons is extremely necessary for the Ukrainians who continue to be shelled by the Russians. At this point, it's no longer about whether they know it will end in war, but about the fact that they see how difficult the situation is on the ground. And the president is changing his position regarding aid to the Ukrainians. Remember, he previously said there would be no more military aid to Ukraine. And now suddenly he is here at the White House together with the Secretary General of NATO, announcing a new package of weapons that he is essentially going to send to NATO. And then the European NATO member countries will pay for it and send it to Ukraine. Such a convoluted way to solve the issue, but essentially it protects Trump politically here. From his promise not to send military aid to Ukraine, but at the same time, it provides Ukraine with the weapons it desperately needs as it continues to be shelled by Russian missiles.
Trump didn't want to send weapons to Ukraine because Ukraine had unrealistic goals, like liberating 100% of its territory from the invaders. For that to happen, World War III would have to start, and neither Europe nor the United States is ready for that. Because more and more weapons led to more and more deaths and destruction. The United States believed that when Ukraine was psychologically ready for negotiations, Russia would also come to the table with the intention of stopping the war. Well, it's clear that Russia has seized something and wants to get something. So that means we didn't send new weapons to Kyiv. But on July 8th of this year, as they say, Trump announced that he and his team no longer have any hope that Putin is telling the truth. And the time has come. The time has come to move from, well, let's say from diplomacy to pressure. To be precise, yes, but first and foremost to ensure the protection of Ukrainian cities from the massive bombings that Putin is now carrying out. Basically, the territory of large cities, firing at everything that exists there, not just military targets.
And I found it very interesting because today was a kind of moment of solidifying disappointment in Vladimir Putin. You know, the president mentioned that he spoke with Putin and felt that they had a great conversation. He said that in the evening he comes home, talks to the first lady and says, "I had a great conversation with Mr. Putin." And she replies to him, "Well, they just dropped bombs." This time, for the first time, you had a feeling of disappointment.
Well, actually, this had been building up over the past few weeks. Remember, at the beginning of June, the president said he was disappointed in Putin. He doesn't like what he sees on the ground, the number of deaths and destruction that continue. And actually, this growing disappointment reached its peak today, when the president announced that not only would he send more military equipment to Ukraine, but he would also impose tariffs against Russia. Now, according to the president, these tariffs will be 100% secondary tariffs on Russia, which will take effect in 50 days. That will be on September 1st, and this will happen if Russia does not agree, does not make peace with Ukraine.
For viewers who aren't very smart, who don't quite get it, let me explain. If India and Brazil are hit with 100% tariffs for buying oil from Russia, wouldn't you want these countries to turn to Putin and tell him that either he stops fighting or they'll go to other suppliers? Or do you want to act like trolls and patrolmen? They write in the comments, "Another delay, we need to strike now." Well, that shows that either they have no brains, right, or they're being paid to copy and post instead of thinking.
If that doesn't happen by then, by all indications, we don't see any attempts by the Russians, first of all, to reduce missile strikes, and secondly, to sit down at the negotiating table with the Ukrainians. We know that their goal was to gain more territory, keep the territories they have already captured, and take even more from Ukraine before returning to negotiations. The president announced that 100% secondary tariffs will be introduced starting September 1st. This is also happening in parallel with what we are seeing in the United States Senate, where a legislative bill on sanctions against Russia is being considered. And I should note that it has 85 co-authors from both parties. These days, it's really hard to find anything in Washington that Congress unanimously agrees on, but it seems that right now it's additional sanctions against Russia. The president said that the United Nations does not yet consider it necessary to impose a 500% tariff on countries that import Russian uranium, gas, and oil. But of course, this option remains on the table if it becomes necessary. And actually, Senator Thune, the leader of the Republican majority in the Senate, will be at the White House later today to discuss this bill. Regarding sanctions, along with the secondary tariffs the president mentioned earlier today. So there are a lot of moving parts here. But to answer your question, yes, this is the culmination of a great deal of frustration from this president toward the Russian President Vladimir Putin.
As president, Trump has the right to impose tariffs of up to 100%. Therefore, until Congress passes this decision, Trump cannot impose more than 100%, and he is imposing the maximum of 100%. How many idiots wrote, yeah, Congress wants 500 and he wants 100? That law doesn't exist yet. So if it happens, it should be when the bill passes, not with the law it will introduce more. With the hope that Russia will decide to start negotiations seriously and not just for show. Well, naturally, we all want to know what's happening with customs duties in general, with those countries that have also slowed down the negotiation process, and how Russia is handling the truce, delaying the signing of agreements.
But they said, well, when is he going to start making deals? In the morning, well, they said, well, when is he going to start making deals? And next time we could just say no. Every time he sends a document where you have to pay 35% or 25% or 50%, and in one case 100%, it's impossible to beat deals like that, but we're still willing to discuss. And literally every country wants to make a deal.
All right. So the president says, using his words, every country wants to make a deal, but we don't hear about a lot of announced deals. It almost feels like there's a line outside the White House, but if you look at the results, there aren't that many.
No, actually, Zidike. According to the White House, they managed to make only 2 deals, one with the United Kingdom and the second with Vietnam. Although regarding the deal with Vietnam, we are still waiting for more details about its specific terms. We know that it was about non-tariff barriers, which they claim will be removed, but other than that, there are very few details. The White House claims that after sending these letters, countries will literally line up to make a deal with the United States. That's exactly why this is being done. It's being done to put pressure on these countries by saying this is what you'll be facing. But look, we haven't seen a single real deal made since these letters started being sent out last week. Of course, economic deals take time, they require lengthy negotiations, and they require a lot of effort from Trump's trade representatives and Secretary Besson to negotiate. But as far as we can see, there hasn't been the immediate response that the president wanted. Well, August 1st is just around the corner, only a couple of weeks left. We'll see what happens before then and whether any economic deals can be made.
And here's the interview with Times Radio, which I've already told you about. 1.5 million subscribers. And basically they work for almost half the world. With former Prime Minister of Russia, Mikhail Kasyanov, about how sanctions affect Putin's regime and today's Russia.
I don't believe this will change the situation. I don't think this will change the situation. And I believe Putin will continue his invasion.
In your opinion, how much are the sanctions currently troubling Putin's regime? So it seems he's not particularly concerned about the imposed sanctions, but maybe he's just pretending. How much are the sanctions bothering Putin and the country?
Individual sanctions? All these packages that were introduced over the 3-year period simply did not have an immediate effect. They did not make Putin stop the war. But they created serious problems for the economy, and now the cumulative effect over 3 years is taking place. And Putin feels that it is becoming harder and harder. By the end of this year, it will be even harder. And even his ministers are already warning him about this. That's why Putin now wants to push and launch an offensive operation, so that in these few months, while he still feels financially stable enough, he can simply crush Ukraine, destroy Ukraine. That's why he keeps saying, I will destroy Ukraine, I will achieve my goals, and so on and so on. But this situation may change. If the oil price cap had really been implemented and enforced, then in that case the inflow of revenues into Putin's federal budget would have decreased, and this would have reduced his ability to finance. That's the problem. He's already facing this issue because oil prices for him are currently somewhat lower. 60, somewhere around 50, but the budget was made with the expectation that the price would be 70. And that's another pressure. The pressure is coming from both sides. On one hand, we expect that Donald Trump will make a statement today. Again, new equipment deliveries, and the second part is reducing Putin's ability to finance. This means reducing his inflow of foreign currency.
Notice we've talked more than once about how Putin sees the clouds gathering and is trying to urgently solve these issues. Well, territory demands to Ukraine, to the world, which in half a year or a year he won't have the strength to resolve. If you know that you're going to stop the war in 4 to 6 months, then you don't have to save on ammunition, right? You can use it now. As if you have an incredible amount of them, and any amount comes just to be used later instead of keeping them in reserve. This alone should have made observers think about a few things.
Putin doesn't have the people for the war. Well, Putin doesn't have people to do the job. All people are now simply being transferred from civilian sectors to the military industry. Yes, they are getting a lot of money, but the civilian sectors are already shrinking, already declining. Official data for the first quarter show that the civilian sectors are already shrinking. That's the problem. You've already encountered this issue this year. The situation will be entirely different by year's end.
That is, if Ukraine holds out, if Russia doesn't capture Ukraine, you think that by the end of the year, Putin might even have to ask for peace because he won't be able to keep doing what he's doing.
Exactly. If the pressure on Putin's regime increases, as I already mentioned, in these two directions, then Putin will become more flexible. And even now, I think if this law is passed in Congress, Lindsey Graham's initiative to impose huge tariffs on those countries that buy Russian oil, if it is adopted, it will become a tool in the hands of the President of the United States. I don't think it will be a decision of Congress. The law will simply give the President the opportunity to act. This is more like verbal pressure, and it's not necessarily that Trump will apply these sanctions, but it will be a tool for pressure. Of course, this won't make Putin immediately sit down at the negotiating table, but it will be real pressure as a potential measure, and I would say a real sanction that will create a big problem for him.
Kasyanov believes that Putin won't rush to make concessions when the new Graham law is introduced. Well, in this case, we're not even talking about Graham's law, but about the 100% sanctions that will come directly from Trump on September 1st. But by that time, of course, the law will already be ready. But if the countries that buy Russian oil and gas start refusing Russian oil, again, and I'll add my own thoughts, if Ukrainians successfully destroy shadow tankers carrying unauthorized, that is, sanctioned oil from Russia, then by the end of 2025, Putin will start having serious problems in industry and finance. What about a possible conflict between Russia and NATO then? Maybe that would be beneficial for Putin?
Do you believe that? Do you believe that, Putin? Do you believe that Putin will start a war with a NATO country?
I believe that such a situation could only become a reality if the West allowed Putin to destroy Ukraine. And if Putin won this victorious war against Ukraine, then he would immediately swallow Moldova, which is nearby and is a small country. And then he would try to test Article 5 of the NATO Charter to see whether this article works or not. Even among countries that are not part of NATO, there is a discussion about whether some countries are ready to come to Poland, for example, or whether Estonia will only fight on the side of NATO. Putin would like to test whether this works at all, but even among NATO members, not everyone believes that it works. So such a possibility exists. It doesn't have to be a tank invasion, but some other way of waging war.
That is, to organize a movement in Lithuania or Latvia to start clashes there between those who want an alliance with Russia and those who are supposedly nationalists, paying both sides for these clashes. Then it means to dress Russian servicemen in quilted jackets and sneakers and send them in, calling them not green men anymore, but brown or yellowish mottled little men. And to seize power in Lithuania, Latvia, or Estonia. And then, after that, to withdraw from NATO, or maybe even more interestingly, to gain access to all NATO secrets through the captured country. And what do the leaders of the Institute for the Study of War in Washington think? By the way, its head is General Kane, I've already talked about him, who refused 3 times. 3 different presidents offered him the position of Minister of Armed Forces, Minister of Defense, in their governments. He refused 3 times. Well, here's what he thinks about all these matters.
Well, I think we're looking at a major turning point. I think we are witnessing the most important turning point in this war. The president came to power with the desire to establish peace, especially between Ukraine and Russia. After some hesitation in the Oval Office, Ukraine agreed to a ceasefire without any conditions. Putin postponed this for months, and the president showed tremendous patience. Mainly because when they talk to each other, Putin behaves politely. He talks about mutual economic benefit. He says, I am just as interested in peace as you are, Mr. President. But then Putin acts tough on the battlefield. The truth is that all this time he has only been escalating the war, especially against civilians, as we have all seen. And the last few days have demonstrated the culmination of this scale and scope of escalation. 500 to 600 objects in the sky, mostly targeting civilian facilities. So the president is experiencing frustration. Putin wanted him to be frustrated, wanted the president to distance himself from Dano and stop supporting Ukraine simply out of frustration and leave it alone. But that's not happening. Despite achieving his goal of frustrating the president is not backing down. In fact, he's actually going to change the course of the war to some extent because he's going to do 2 things. First, he's going to increase military aid and allow Europeans to buy our weapons systems. They have the money for it, and they will either let Ukraine buy them from themselves or transfer them to Ukraine directly. So we will strengthen Ukraine's military capabilities. And believe me, Putin is watching the results on the battlefield very closely because that's what he's focused on. And we will also give permission to the Senate and eventually to the House of Representatives. And the Europeans will do the same to impose rather tough sanctions, especially against those who buy Russian oil. These are China, India, and Brazil.
The most important thing here was the statement that Europe will impose sanctions on countries that buy Russian energy resources. Honestly, I don't really understand how they are going to impose sanctions on themselves. But China, India, and Brazil are probably thinking things through and communicating with each other behind the scenes. I don't know, but it seems that some other sources, alternative sources to Russian oil and gas, have been found.
So both of these put together is kind of a 1-2 punch. So together these 2 steps represent a kind of 1-2 punch to directly address the problem with Russia on the battlefield, as well as their source of income, which is obviously extremely important for keeping their troops trained and well equipped. In my opinion, this is a crucial turning point that comes as a result of the failed negotiations with Putin.
What will our weapons be used for?
Ukraine is conducting an outstanding and successful defense against a force that outnumbers it 2-to-1 on the ground. And Putin has intensified attacks on civilians, which in itself is a war crime. And he has increased the number of child abductions and their deportation to Russia. We're talking about approximately 20,000 people, which is just terrible if you think about it. So yeah, why is he doing this and why the focus on civilians? He wants to break the will of the Ukrainian people and undermine their support for the government and the war so that they give up and say enough. And this will force Zelensky to make serious concessions to the Russians. And this is not happening because the Ukrainian people are unwavering. They still support Zelensky. Would they like to see a peace agreement and put an end to the war? Of course. But they are not going to do it on Russian terms.
In the United States, they clearly understand both the military and psychological situation. And Kaine is a close associate and advisor to Trump, so thinking that Trump is naive and doesn't understand the situation is pretty foolish. Well, I'm not even talking about the idea that Trump is somehow also Agent Krasnov. Only complete idiots who graduated from higher education institutions where their brains were washed for many years and they were trained to be part of the herd. Only they can believe in this.
China and at least certainly North Korea are helping Russia with soldiers. How does the president perceive China's involvement in this?
Well, China's involvement has been very comprehensive. Initially, I think we didn't fully understand how comprehensive it was. Although they don't provide full-fledged armed platforms like artillery systems or tanks, they supply components, minerals, chemicals, and MyCats. They obviously help finance this through Russian oil, so they are a major financier. But the way they help on the battlefield is truly impressive. And you know, to successfully hold your ground on the battlefield, Bill and Lana, you need not only the weapons themselves, you need all the logistics, the support. China is the main supplier of comprehensive support to Russia. And right behind them are the Iranians, who set up a drone manufacturing plant and built it inside Russia. And they help unleash all this terror on Ukrainian cities. As we can see, especially in the last few days.
In fact, World War III is already underway. It's just not called that because everyone hopes it will go away on its own. China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea on one side. NATO, including Europe and the United States, on the other. Plus Israel, plus the Sunnis, plus Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Vietnam, and I hope Turkey on the other. And in the middle, well, there's India, Latin America, part of Asia, and Africa is still in the middle for now. For now, it's possible to stay in the middle. Because both sides, if something happens, if something starts brewing, they'll demand, are you with us or are you against us? Maria Zakharova, a representative of the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, responded to Trump's threats by saying that no sanctions will make Russia abandon the path toward achieving the goals and objectives facing the country. You just want to say set for us by the party. But the party no longer plays a role. Instead, the cooperative, O0, plays the role now. At the same time, in both the Russian and Ukrainian press, journalists and bloggers began to mock Trump's efforts to end the war, calling him an idiot, a narcissist, insane, a loser, and Putin's puppet. Moreover, Russian media focused more on the loser label, while Ukrainian media emphasized narcissist and Putin's lackey or Putin's mouthpiece, depending on who was writing. It's interesting that both warring sides hate the person who tries to stop the fratricidal war, which has already claimed 1 million lives. In Congo and Rwanda, it took 6 million deaths before the leaders of the two countries agreed to a truce. Maybe it will take 6 million, 16 million deaths of all Russians and Ukrainians. so that both sides lose their desire to fight enough to agree to talk to each other. On the evening show with Vladimir Solovyov, Mr. Solovyov said, "If you, well, Americans," he was addressing us, Americans, "suddenly disappear. If you suddenly disappear from the world's markets, the world will finally be able to breathe more freely." And the next gem is, "And what do you even make that people use?" Afterwards, he did something intriguing. He pulled out his iPhone to see if he missed saying anything. And here's what Russians think about us.
Most of the people who vote for Trump are not very smart, primitive people, and that's exactly how you need to talk to them. With cliché, dumb slogans.
For these rednecks, for that kind of crowd, for the country folks, so to speak, who are shouting out,
"Oh, I'm terribly sorry." 10 words that he rearranges in places. Such a bad person. I'll go now. You're not electing him. No, really, listen. And this person is planning to be president again.
That's his manner.
Enough. Yes, I'm not talking about myself, idiot. Such an idiot. That's just his way of communicating.
How much are they giving there? 14 billion to Israel. I would give 140 billion and to Ukraine. Where is Ukraine? 60 billion, nothing. It's all for Israel.
Beautiful, beautiful, just like that there. And Maxim Yashin, if you noticed, said that most of those who voted for Trump are not very smart and not very educated people. He thought for a moment and added, "Primitive, those who only understand cliches and dumb slogans. He said this about us, about you and me." That's on the Russian version of 60 Minutes. It was said that Trump often gives reasons to doubt his mental abilities, but specifically what reasons and how often he does this were not mentioned. Because the audience doesn't ask questions, they just swallow whatever they're given. On Ukrainian television, it's often, you hear words like this. This guy, well, Trump is talking to the scoundrel and fascist Putin, with the Hitler of the 21st century. So does that mean he's the same? Trump's desire to end the bloodshed causes intense hatred. On the issue of the population, Ukrainian media has led people to the point where 73% believe that Trump is either bad for Ukraine or an enemy of Ukraine. Trump is an enemy of Ukraine. Reports have appeared in Ukrainian media that Trump gave Putin until the end of August, since Putin told him that he would be intensively bombing Ukraine for 2 months. And Trump wants to let his friend or maybe his boss or PVDRI bomb everything he wants. Other sources say that Putin told Trump that after conquering the territories of Luhansk, Donetsk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia regions, he will stop and take what is already written into the Russian Constitution, and he won't go any further. And Trump believed him and said, "Brother, take it." In other words, both the Ukrainian press and elite, as well as the Russian press and elite, are doing everything they can to get Trump to stop the war. But Trump and we, gentlemen, are aware of what the mothers of Ukrainian children think, who serve and fight in this very army. And how many percent of Ukrainian land is more important to them than the lives of their sons? So now it's up to the countries that risk getting 100% import tariffs on their exports to the United States. Let's wait and see what they say. That's India, Brazil, well, China, but with China, of course, it's a special case. And dozens, by the way, of smaller buyers and recipients of Russian energy resources. Russia's reaction and actions will actually depend on their position. So let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's wait and see. At least from my point of view, there are a lot of great news.